Have you ever stood somewhere that felt peaceful while knowing it once witnessed unimaginable violence? Today, Fort King is one of Ocala's most visited historic sites. Families walk these grounds, children explore the reconstructed fort, birds sing from the pine trees, and the breeze carries little more than the scent of Florida's forests. But beneath the quiet surface lies one of the darkest chapters in Florida's history. This wasn't simply a military outpost. It was the center of a war, a place where promises were broken, lives were uprooted, and an entire people fought for the right to remain on the land they had always called home. Today we're walking through Fort King and uncovering the forgotten story that still echoes through these woods. Over the past few weeks, I've found myself diving deeper into Florida's Seminole War history. I've visited places like Fort Brooke in Tampa, Fort Cooper near Inverness, and each stop has left me wanting to understand the bigger picture. Fort King kept appearing in nearly every story, so eventually curiosity won. I pointed the truck toward Ocala to see it for myself. I'll admit, I wasn't expecting much. Fort Cooper is little more than a reconstructed corner of a stockade with interpretive signs explaining what once stood there. I assumed Fort King would be something similar. Instead, I rounded the trees and found an entire fort. The full perimeter has been reconstructed, complete with towering wooden walls, blockhouses, cabins, and open parade grounds. For just a moment, it almost feels like you've stepped back into the 1830s. But that's the thing about places like this. Sometimes the more complete the reconstruction becomes, the easier it is to forget what actually happened here. Long before any fort stood on this hill, this land belonged to the Seminole people. The Seminoles weren't a single tribe. They were a confederation of Native American peoples who had gradually migrated into Florida over generations. What made their story especially unique was who joined them. Florida was still under Spanish control for much of this period, and enslaved Africans escaping plantations to the north often crossed into Florida seeking freedom. Many found refuge among the Seminoles. Together they built communities, families, trade, friendships, and a culture unlike anywhere else in North America. To those seeking freedom, Florida represented hope. To plantation owners across the South, it represented a threat. Everything changed in 1821 when Florida became part of the United States. Almost immediately, pressure mounted to remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands. Then came the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Championed by President Andrew Jackson, it authorized the forced relocation of Native peoples throughout the southeastern United States. The goal wasn't negotiation. It wasn't coexistence. It was removal. Fort King, built just a few years earlier in 1827, suddenly became one of the most important military posts in Florida. It sat near the Seminole Reservation boundary, quite literally becoming a line between two very different worlds. One side represented expanding American settlement. The other represented people determined to remain on the land their families called home. One man stood directly between those worlds. His name was Wiley Thompson. He served as the United States Indian agent assigned to oversee the Seminoles. His job was simple on paper: persuade or force the Seminoles to leave Florida. But nothing about this situation was simple. Among the Seminole leaders was a young warrior named Osceola. Today, Osceola has become one of Florida's most recognizable historical figures. But at the time, he was simply a man refusing to watch his people disappear. As negotiations deteriorated, distrust grew on both sides. Thompson eventually banned the sale of guns and ammunition to the Seminoles. To American officials, it was a security measure. To Osceola, it was an insult. He reportedly believed Thompson was treating his people no differently than enslaved people who were forbidden from carrying weapons. The confrontation became deeply personal. Eventually, Thompson ordered Osceola imprisoned inside Fort King's walls. Although he was later released after agreeing to cooperate, something had changed. Some humiliations don't end when the prison door opens. Sometimes they're only beginning. December 28th, 1835. It's difficult to imagine this place on that morning. The same gentle breeze, the same pine trees, the same birds. History rarely announces when everything is about to change. Wiley Thompson left the safety of Fort King for what should have been an ordinary walk. Hidden among the trees, Osceola and a group of Seminole warriors waited. Gunfire shattered the silence. Within moments, Wiley Thompson lay dead. The conflict that had simmered for years suddenly exploded into open war. But remarkably, that wasn't even the biggest story of the day. Miles away, another Seminole force waited beside a sandy military road. A column of 110 United States soldiers under Major Francis Dade marched toward Fort King, unaware they were walking into one of the most devastating ambushes in American military history. The attack lasted only minutes. Almost the entire command was wiped out. The event became known as the Dade Massacre, and overnight, newspapers across America realized something many had underestimated. The Seminoles weren't surrendering. They were fighting back. The Second Seminole War would stretch on for 7 brutal years. It became America's longest, costliest, and one of its deadliest wars of Indian removal. The Seminoles understood something the U.S. Army did not. Florida itself could become a weapon. The swamps, the hammocks, the endless pine forests, they weren't obstacles, they were home. Seminole warriors struck quietly, disappeared into terrain they knew intimately, and forced the military into a style of warfare it wasn't prepared for. Disease claimed almost as many soldiers as combat. Supplies disappeared. Morale suffered. Even Fort King itself wasn't spared. In 1836, Seminole warriors attacked and burned much of the fort. The United States eventually rebuilt it even larger than before. This wasn't simply a frontier fort anymore. It had become headquarters for a war. As the fighting continued, General Thomas Jessup arrived with thousands of additional troops. He understood something that changed the course of the war. The Seminoles weren't fighting alone. Among them were the Black Seminoles, formerly enslaved men and women who had built new lives alongside the Seminoles. They served as interpreters, scouts, warriors, neighbors, families. Jessup reportedly wrote that this was a Negro, not an Indian war. He believed if he could destroy that alliance, he could end the resistance. So he made a promise. Any Black Seminole who surrendered and agreed to relocate west would receive their freedom. For families exhausted by years of war, it sounded like hope. Many accepted. But promises made during war are sometimes the easiest to break. Instead of guaranteed freedom, many found themselves detained. Others were claimed by slaveholders. Some were forced back into slavery despite the assurances they had been given. Captured Seminoles and Black Seminoles were even compelled to help guide American troops through territory they once defended. It wasn't just military strategy, it was betrayal. One that forever changed the course of the conflict. Eventually, the numbers became impossible to overcome. Thousands of Seminoles were captured and forced west to present-day Oklahoma. Families were separated, communities disappeared. The journey became part of the larger tragedy we know today as the Trail of Tears. But one remarkable truth remains. The United States never actually signed a peace treaty with the Seminoles. A small group simply refused to surrender. They disappeared deep into the Everglades, where their descendants still live today. That's why you'll often hear the Seminole tribe of Florida called the Unconquered People. It's not just a nickname, it's history. By the time the war ended in 1842, Fort King had already begun changing. Its military importance faded. The fort slowly disappeared. Local stories suggest some of its lumber even found new life in Ocala's first courthouse. The violence became quieter, then almost forgotten. The cemetery that once served the soldiers stationed here eventually disappeared as well. Many of those buried here were later reinterred in St. Augustine. Today, very little remains to tell visitors it was ever here. After walking around the reconstructed fort, I remembered reading about that old cemetery. Apparently, the graves themselves had been moved years ago, but the Daughters of the American Revolution had placed a memorial where the cemetery once stood. And if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you already know. If there's a cemetery nearby, I'm probably going to find it. At first, I couldn't. I wandered around looking for it while the visitor center happened to open for the day. So I stepped inside. The museum was small, but surprisingly well done. There are artifacts recovered during archaeological excavations, pieces of pottery, musket balls, tools, and everyday objects pulled directly from beneath these grounds. It's one thing to read about history. It's another to stand inches away from something someone last touched nearly 2 centuries ago. I watched the orientation film, explored the exhibits, browsed the little gift shop, and finally asked one of the staff where the cemetery had been. They pointed me toward a quiet field just beyond the reconstructed fort. When I arrived, it didn't really look like a cemetery anymore. Just an open stretch of grass beneath the Florida sky. No rows of headstones, no elaborate monuments, just one memorial. And if you really slow down, subtle rises and dips in the ground that hint where graves may have once rested. It's quiet, almost unbelievably quiet. Standing there, it's hard to imagine soldiers once buried beneath your feet. Harder still to imagine the conflict that unfolded just beyond that field. The memorial doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't need to. Sometimes the loudest stories are told in silence. I spent a few minutes there, thinking about everyone connected to this place. The soldiers, the settlers, the Seminoles, the Black Seminoles, the families who lost fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, often because powerful people hundreds of miles away made decisions for them. History has a way of reducing people into dates. battles, and statistics. Places like this remind us they were human beings first. Fort King isn't haunted because of ghosts. It's haunted by memory. By the uncomfortable realization that history is rarely as simple as we learned in school. Heroes become more complicated. Villains become more human. And sometimes, entire chapters quietly disappear from textbooks altogether. Walking these grounds today, it's easy to admire the craftsmanship of the reconstructed walls. It's easy to appreciate the museum. It's easy to enjoy a peaceful morning beneath the pines. But I think it's equally important to remember why this place existed. Not simply to defend a frontier, but to enforce a policy that forever changed countless lives. History doesn't become less painful because enough time has passed. If anything, time makes remembering even more important. If you've visited Fort King before, I'd love to hear what stood out to you. And if this video introduced you to part of Florida history that you hadn't heard before, let me know down in the comments. There are still so many forgotten places and forgotten stories waiting along the back roads, and I can't wait to share more of them with you. If you enjoy exploring the strange, the sacred, and the forgotten, I'd love to have you along for the journey. As I drove away that morning, Fort King slowly disappeared behind the trees. The birds kept singing. The wind kept moving through the pines. To anyone passing by, it would seem like just another beautiful park. But now I know better. Beneath those beautiful trails lies the memory of a people who refused to disappear, of promises that were broken, and of a history that deserves to be remembered in all its complexity. Sometimes the quiet places have the loudest stories, and Fort King is still telling its story to anyone willing to stop and listen.